The bell above the cafe door chimed, a sound so aggressively ordinary that Abel Jason barely registered it. He was a man accustomed to the insulated, soundproofed silence of corner offices and chauffeured Maybachs, but a sudden, violent Seattle downpour had forced him into this cramped, cinnamon-scented coffee shop to wait for his driver. He wiped the cold rain from his tailored suit, looking up to order a meaningless espresso, and the breath was violently punched from his lungs. There she was, LaDonna, the wife who had allegedly betrayed him, destroyed his heart, and vanished 5 years ago with a massive settlement. But the real shock wasn't the tired lines around her beautiful familiar face, or the faded apron she wore. It was the 2 4-year-old boys clinging to her legs behind the counter, boys who turned to look at him with the exact, unmistakable, piercing ice-blue eyes of the Jason bloodline. Abel Jason did not believe in fate. He believed in leverage, hostile takeovers, and ironclad non-disclosure agreements. At 34, he was the CEO of Jason Omnicorp, a real estate and tech conglomerate that effectively owned the Seattle skyline. His life was a meticulously curated spreadsheet, devoid of unpredictable variables. He had ruthlessly excised anything and anyone that threatened his control. 5 years ago, that included his wife. The memories of LaDonna were usually locked in a mental vault, buried beneath layers of corporate strategy and meaningless high society gala dates. But today, the universe had decided to rip the vault wide open. It started with a blown tire on Interstate 5. His driver, Thomas, had apologized profusely, navigating the crippled luxury sedan to the shoulder, just as the sky ripped open in a torrential, blinding downpour. Stranded in a neighborhood Abel usually only saw from a helicopter, he had dashed into the nearest shelter, a dilapidated, brick-faced establishment called the Roasted Bean. The air inside was thick with the scent of roasted Arabica, burnt milk, and damp wool from the scattering of locals escaping the storm. Abel stood near the door, shaking the water from his $3,000 bespoke coat, his jaw clenched in irritation. He stepped up to the counter, pulling his phone out to check his emails, not even glancing at the barista. "What can I get for you?" a voice asked. Abel froze. The phone nearly slipped from his damp fingers. It was a voice he had heard in his dreams for years before he finally learned how to drink himself into dreamless sleep. Soft, with a slight, breathless lilt. He raised his head slowly, his heart hammering a sudden, violent rhythm against his ribs. LaDonna. She was wiping down the espresso machine, her back half-turned. Her chestnut hair, which used to fall in perfectly styled waves down her back, was now shoved into a messy, utilitarian bun, secured with a cheap plastic clip. She wore a faded green apron covered in flour dust and coffee stains over a simple black t-shirt. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her shoulders carried a heavy, invisible weight. But it was unequivocally her, the woman who had, according to his mother and his lawyers, engaged in a string of affairs, forged his signature on company documents, and demanded a $10 million payout to walk away from their marriage and abort their unborn child. Abel couldn't breathe. A potent cocktail of rage, betrayal, and a sickening, undeniable pull of lingering affection flooded his veins. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand what the hell she was doing slinging coffee when she had $10 million of his money in offshore accounts. Before he could form the words, a small voice broke the tension. "Mommy, Leo won't share the red crayon." Abel's gaze snapped downward. Emerging from the swinging door that led to the back room were 2 small boys. They were identical. They couldn't have been more than 4 years old. They wore faded denim overalls and slightly scuffed sneakers. "Sam, buddy, "I told you, you have to take turns," LaDonna said, her entire demeanor softening instantly. The exhaustion melted from her face, replaced by a radiant, overwhelming love as she knelt behind the counter to wipe a smudge of chocolate from the boy's cheek. Abel stood paralyzed. The boy named Sam looked up, his attention caught by the tall, imposing man staring at them. The world tilted on its axis. The boy didn't have LaDonna's warm, hazel eyes. He had Abel's, and not just blue eyes. They possessed the distinct, piercing, ice-blue shade with a dark slate ring around the iris. It was a genetic anomaly that had been passed down through the Jasson men for 4 generations. The other boy, Leo, peeked around his mother's leg, boasting the exact same eyes and the exact same stubborn cowlick at the front of his dark hair that Abel fought with gel every morning. Twins. His twins. The realization hit Abel with the force of a freight train. She hadn't aborted the pregnancy. The medical documents his lawyer had shown him, the ones that had finally broken his spirit and made him sign the divorce papers without looking at her, they were a lie? Or was this some twisted long con? "Sir, are you ready to order?" LaDonna stood up, finally turning her full attention to him. Her eyes met his. The rag in her hand slipped, hitting the linoleum floor with a wet slap. All the color drained from her face, leaving her as pale as porcelain. Her breath hitched, and she instinctively took a step back, her hands flying out to push the twins slightly behind her legs, a fiercely protective, almost terrified gesture. "Abel," she whispered. Her voice trembled, laced not with guilt, but with pure, unadulterated fear. Abel's mind was a chaotic storm. He looked from her terrified face to the boys who were staring at him with innocent, wide eyes. The air in the cafe felt too thin. He was a master of confrontation in the boardroom. But here, under the flickering fluorescent lights of a rundown cafe, he was utterly defenseless. He didn't scream. He didn't demand answers. The shock was too profound, the implications too massive. He simply turned around, pushed the glass door open, and walked back out into the blinding rain, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Abel didn't go back to the office. He had Thomas drive him straight to his penthouse overlooking Puget Sound, locked himself in his private study, and poured a heavy measure of Macallan 25. He didn't drink it. He just stared at the amber liquid, the image of those 2 boys burning behind his retinas, Leo and Sam. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in 3 years. "Richard," Abel said the moment the line connected, "I need you in my office. Now, drop whatever you are doing." Richard Croft was the best private investigator on the West Coast, a former intelligence officer with a terrifying ability to unearth buried secrets. He was the only man Abel trusted outside of his immediate corporate circle. Less than an hour later, Richard sat across from Abel's mahogany desk, his notepad open. Abel recounted the events at the cafe with cold, clinical detachment, though his hands shook slightly. "I need to know everything," Abel commanded, his voice tight. "I want her bank records. I want her housing history. I want the birth certificates of those boys. I need to know why a woman with $10 million of my money is working for minimum wage and living in what looked like absolute terror of me." "Consider it done," Richard said, his expression grave. "Give me 48 hours." Those 48 hours were a living hell. Abel barely slept. He paced his apartment, tormented by flashbacks of their bitter end. He remembered the screaming match in this very room. He had just been handed a dossier by his mother, Beatrice Jasson, and his chief legal counsel, Simon Caldwell. The dossier contained photos of LaDonna entering a hotel with another man. It contained bank transfers, showing she had been siphoning funds from their joint accounts, and most devastatingly, it contained a medical record showing she had terminated her pregnancy, the pregnancy they had been trying for, the child Hebel had desperately wanted. When he confronted her, she had been hysterical. She denied everything, crying, begging him to believe her. But the evidence was right there. Simon Caldwell had stood by, shaking his head with faux sympathy, while Beatrice had sneered, calling LaDonna a gutter rat, showing her true colours. Hebel had thrown her out. He told her she was dead to him. He instructed Simon to draft the most aggressive divorce settlement possible, throwing a lump sum of $10 million at her just to make her disappear forever, requiring her to sign an NDA that forbade her from ever contacting him again. On the morning of the third day, Richard Croft returned. He didn't look triumphant. He looked deeply disturbed. He placed a thick manila folder on Hebel's desk. "Hebel," Richard began, his tone cautious. "You need to brace yourself. Nothing you told me about your divorce matches the reality of the last 5 years." Hebel frowned, opening the folder. "What are you talking about?" "Let's start with the money," Richard said, pointing to the first page. LaDonna Bennett never received $10 million. In fact, she never received a dime. Hebel's head snapped up. "That's impossible. I authorized the wire transfer myself. I saw the receipt." "You saw a receipt for a wire transfer to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands," Richard corrected softly. "I tracked that account. It's obscured behind 3 shell companies, but I managed to pierce the corporate veil. The ultimate beneficiary of that account isn't LaDonna Bennett. It's Simon Caldwell." The silence in the room was deafening. Hebel stared at the investigator, the words echoing in his mind. Simon, his lawyer, his supposed friend. "Go on," Hebel rasped, his throat suddenly bone dry. "LaDonna left your penthouse that night with literally nothing but a suitcase," Richard continued, turning the pages for Hebel. "She spent the first 3 months living in a women's shelter in Tacoma. She took jobs cleaning houses and waitressing. 7 months after you threw her out, she gave birth to twins. The medical bills put her in massive debt. She's been working 2 jobs ever since, just to keep them fed and housed in a cramped 2-bedroom walk-up in the industrial district." Hebel felt physically sick, the edges of his vision blurred. The birth certificates. Richard slid a photocopy across the desk. "Leo and Samuel Bennett. Date of birth aligns perfectly with her pregnancy when you were married. Under father, the line is blank. She listed him as unknown." Hebel picked up the paper. His fingers brushed over the names. His sons. They had been born in a charity hospital while he was drinking champagne at corporate galas, cursing their mother's name. "There's more," Richard said, his voice lowering. "I dug into the dossier that provoked the divorce. The photos of her at the hotel, deepfakes. High quality, but doctoring is evident if you know what to look for. The bank transfers, authorized from a terminal inside Jason Omnicorp, using a cloned IP address, and the medical record of the abortion." Richard sighed heavily. "Forged. She was going to an obstetrician for regular prenatal care. I spoke to the doctor's office. They remembered her. They remembered she was devastated because her husband had abandoned her." Hebel stood up so fast his heavy leather chair crashed backward onto the floor. He couldn't breathe. The betrayal was so vast, so deep, it felt like the floor had opened up to swallow him. He hadn't just been lied to. He had been manipulated into destroying his own family, and the architects of his misery were the people he trusted most, his lawyer and— "My mother," Hebel whispered, the realization striking him like a physical blow. "Beatrice. She hated LaDonna from day one. She thought she was common, too poor for the Jasson legacy. I haven't found direct financial links to Beatrice Jasson yet, Richard warned. But Simon Caldwell wouldn't have the audacity to execute a $10 million fraud and destroy your marriage without top cover. Your mother is the only one with the power to shield him. Hebel walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city he owned. He had everything, but the only things that mattered had been stolen from him, and he had helped the thieves pack the bags. "Where is she now?" Hebel asked, his voice deadly quiet. It wasn't the voice of a broken man. It was the voice of a predator that had just realized who its prey was. "It's Saturday," Richard said, checking his watch. "She usually takes the boys to Centennial Park on her only afternoon off." Hebel turned around. "I need you to freeze all accounts connected to Simon Caldwell. Do it quietly. Bring in your best forensic accountants. I want him ruined, legally and financially, before he even realizes he's under attack." "And what are you going to do?" Richard asked. Hebel walked past him, grabbing his coat. "I'm going to meet my sons, and I am going to beg my wife for her life." Centennial Park was bathed in the golden, hazy light of a late Saturday afternoon. The air was crisp, filled with the sounds of distant traffic and the immediate, chaotic joy of children playing. Hebel parked his own car. He didn't want Thomas or anyone else witnessing this 2 blocks away. He walked toward the playground, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence he hadn't felt since he was a teenager. He felt entirely out of his element. He wasn't wearing a suit. He had changed into dark jeans and a simple grey sweater, attempting to look less intimidating, but his rigid posture betrayed him. He spotted them almost immediately. LaDonna was sitting on a weathered wooden bench near the sandbox. She looked breathtakingly beautiful in the autumn light, wearing a thick, oversized cardigan. But the tension in her posture was palpable. Her eyes darted constantly around the park, watchful, protective. In the sandbox, Leo and Sam were busy constructing a massive, structurally unsound castle. They were laughing, throwing handfuls of sand, entirely oblivious to the heavy, complicated world of adults. Hebel took a deep breath, fighting the sudden urge to vomit, and forced his legs to move forward. As he approached, LaDonna glanced up. The soft smile she wore while watching her boys vanished instantly. She shot to her feet, dropping the thermos she was holding. It clattered against the pavement, spilling lukewarm tea. "Boys," she said, her voice sharp and urgent. "Come here, right now." Leo and Sam, sensing the sudden shift in their mother's tone, scrambled out of the sandbox and ran to her side, hiding behind her legs, just as they had in the cafe. Hebel stopped 10 feet away. He held his hands up slowly, palms outward, a gesture of surrender. "LaDonna," he said softly. "Please, I'm not here to hurt you." "Stay away from us," she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. She took a step back, shielding the boys. "I mean it, Hebel. I will scream. I will call the police. You have no right to be here." "I know," Hebel said, his voice breaking. It was the first time in 5 years his voice had broken. "I know I don't. But I need to talk to you. Please." "Talk." She let out a harsh, bitter laugh that lacked any real humor. "We have nothing to talk about. You made everything perfectly clear 5 years ago when you threw me out into the street. You wanted us gone. We're gone. Now leave us alone." Hebel took a hesitant step forward. "LaDonna, please. I didn't know." He gestured helplessly toward the twins, who were peeking at him with wide, curious eyes. "I didn't know about them." LaDonna's expression twisted in disbelief and outrage. "You didn't know? Are you insane? You looked me in the eye and told me our baby was a parasite you were glad I got rid of. You told me I was a gold-digging whore and that I disgusted you." The words felt like physical blows. Hebel flinched, the memories of that night rushing back. He had said those things. He had been so blinded by the forged evidence, so consumed by the agony of what he thought was her betrayal, that he had wanted to hurt her as deeply as he felt hurt. "I thought you aborted the pregnancy, LaDonna," Hebel pleaded, tears finally pooling in his eyes. "Simon showed me the medical records. He showed me photos of you with another man. He showed me bank transfers. I thought you had stolen from me and killed our child." LaDonna stared at him, her chest heaving. The sheer absurdity of his words seemed to momentarily paralyze her. "What? What are you talking about? Medical records? Photos? Hebel, I was pregnant. I told you I was pregnant, and you told me I was lying to trap you. You said your lawyers had proof I was sleeping around, and you forced me out with nothing but my clothes." "But the settlement," Hebel insisted, desperation bleeding into his tone. "I signed off on a $10 million settlement. I thought you took the money and ran. I thought you were living in luxury." "Money!" LaDonna yelled, no longer caring who in the park was watching them. "What money? Simon Caldwell came to the shelter a week after you kicked me out. He handed me papers and said, if I didn't sign them, waiving all rights to your estate, you would drag me through court, prove I was an unfit mother, and take the baby away the moment it was born. He said you hated me and never wanted to see my face again. I signed them because I was terrified of you, Hebel. I signed them to protect my babies." The final pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with sickening clarity. Hebel fell to his knees. Right there in the dirt, ruining his expensive clothes, he collapsed. The gravity of what had been done to them, the masterful, evil manipulation orchestrated by his own lawyer and his mother, was too heavy to bear standing up. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, agonizing sobs. He had lost 5 years of his life. He had lost the love of his life. He had missed the birth of his sons, their first steps, their first words, all because he had been too blind, too arrogant, and too trusting of the wrong people. "Hebel?" LaDonna's voice was hesitant now. The fury had ebbed, replaced by confusion and a dawning, terrifying realization. She looked at the powerful, untouchable billionaire crying in the dirt at her feet. Slowly, a small figure stepped out from behind LaDonna's legs. It was Leo. He walked cautiously over to Hebel. LaDonna reached out to stop him, but her hand hovered in the air, paralyzed by the surreal nature of the moment. Leo stopped in front of Hebel. He reached out a small, chubby hand and patted Hebel's head awkwardly. "Don't cry, mister," Leo said in a soft, high-pitched voice. "Did you scrape your knee?" Hebel looked up. Through his tears, he stared into a miniature mirror of his own face. He reached out, his hand trembling violently, and gently cupped his son's cheek. The boy didn't flinch. He just stared back with those profound, ice-blue Jasson eyes. "No, buddy," Hebel choked out, forcing a broken smile. I lost something very important a long time ago, and I just found it." He looked up at LaDonna. She was crying now, too, her hand covering her mouth as the horrific truth of the last 5 years settled over them both. "LaDonna!" Hebel swore, his voice suddenly hardening into cold steel, wiping the tears from his face. "I'm going to fix this. I'm going to tear Simon Caldwell's life apart, piece by piece. And my mother." He paused, the anger radiating from him like heat. "They stole our lives, but they are not going to steal one more second." LaDonna looked at him, the fear still lingering in her eyes, but mixed now with a tiny, fragile spark of hope. Before she could answer, a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb nearest the park entrance. The tinted window rolled down halfway. Abel's blood ran cold. He recognized the car. He recognized the license plate. Sitting in the back seat, half-shadowed but unmistakable, was Beatrice Jasson, and she was staring directly at LaDonna and the twins. Abel's blood turned to ice. The sight of that sleek black Maybach, idling like a predator at the edge of Centennial Park, shattered the fragile, emotionally charged bubble he and LaDonna had just stepped into. He knew the license plate. He knew the tinted glass. And he knew the woman sitting behind it. "LaDonna," Hebel said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping seamlessly into the commanding tone he used when millions of dollars and corporate futures were on the line. "Don't look at the street. Pick up the boys. Now." LaDonna blinked, still wiping tears from her flushed cheeks, disoriented by his sudden shift in demeanor. "What? Hebel, what is it?" "My mother is in that car," he said, stepping sideways to place his broad frame entirely between LaDonna and the street. "She's watching us." A fresh wave of terror washed over LaDonna's face. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed Sam's hand and scooped a protesting Leo into her arms. The 5 years of running, of looking over her shoulder, had honed her maternal instincts into a razor-sharp survival mechanism. "Take my keys," Hebel instructed, pressing the heavy fob for his discreet Audi RS6 into her trembling palm. "It's parked 2 blocks down, corner of 4th and Pine. Go straight to the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. Go to the front desk and ask for William Hayes. He is the general manager, and he is a personal friend. Tell him you need the presidential suite under the Jasson corporate account. He will ask no questions. Wait for me there." "Hebel, I can't just take your car and go to a luxury hotel." "LaDonna, listen to me," Hebel interrupted, his ice-blue eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, desperate intensity. "Beatrice just realized you didn't disappear. She just realized she has 2 heirs running around in a public park. I do not know what she or Simon are capable of, but I know what they have already done. Go, please. Let me protect you this time." LaDonna looked at the imposing man in front of her, then down at the keys, and finally at the boys who were watching them with wide, confused eyes. She gave a single tight nod. Clutching the twins close, she turned and hurried away down the winding park path, disappearing behind a grove of ancient oak trees. Hebel waited until he was certain they were out of sight. Then he turned his attention to the idling Maybach. He didn't walk. He stalked toward it. As he approached, the rear passenger window rolled down the rest of the way with a quiet hum. Beatrice Jasson sat in the plush leather interior, a picture of chilling, aristocratic elegance. She wore a tailored Chanel suit, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, a string of flawless South Sea pearls resting against her collarbone. She looked at Hebel with an expression of mild, detached amusement. "Afternoon, Hebel," Beatrice said, her voice smooth and devoid of any maternal warmth. "Taking a stroll through the public sector? How very bohemian of you." Hebel gripped the edge of the window frame, his knuckles turning white. "What are you doing here, Mother?" "I was merely checking on an investment," she replied smoothly, her gaze drifting toward the trees where LaDonna had vanished. Or rather, a loose end. Simon informed me that Richard Croft had been making inquiries at some rather unsavory local banks. I assumed you had caught a scent of nostalgia." "Nostalgia?" Hebel sneered, the sheer audacity of the woman making his stomach turn. "Is that what you call forging medical records to make me think my wife aborted our child? Is that what you call orchestrating a $10 million embezzlement scheme to frame her?" Beatrice let out a delicate, perfectly practiced sigh. She adjusted her diamond-encrusted Patek Philippe watch. "Hebel, darling, don't be melodramatic. Simon Caldwell is an opportunistic snake. If he stole money from your accounts and pinned it on that little barista, that is a matter for the authorities. I had nothing to do with it. Do not lie to me, Hebel snarled, leaning closer. Simon wouldn't dare execute a fraud of that magnitude against Jason Omnicorp without your absolute protection. You hated LaDonna because she wasn't bred in your miserable country clubs. You wanted her gone. I wanted what was best for the Jason legacy, Beatrice corrected, her eyes narrowing slightly. The facade of amusement was slipping, revealing the cold, calculating matriarch beneath. She was a gold digger, Hebel, a temporary distraction. I simply ensured she didn't permanently tarnish our name. They are my sons, Hebel said, his voice trembling with a terrifying, suppressed rage. You stole 5 years of their lives. You left them in a women's shelter while you drank champagne in my penthouse. Beatrice's gaze hardened into flint. And look at them now, wearing cheap denim and playing in public dirt. This is exactly why she is unfit. But she paused, a predatory smile touching the corners of her painted lips. They do have your eyes, the Jason eyes. Now that I know they exist, we will have to make arrangements. Custody battles can be so dreadfully messy, especially when the mother has a documented history of mental instability and poverty. I'm sure a judge would see reason. Hebel felt a cold sweat break out across his back. She wasn't retreating, she was pivoting. She was going to try and take the boys. If you or your lawyers come within 100 miles of LaDonna or those boys, Hebel whispered, his voice dangerously soft, I will dismantle you. I will freeze your assets. I will expose every illegal kickback you've taken from the Jason board over the last 2 decades, and I will see you rot in a federal prison. Beatrice scoffed, though a flicker of genuine alarm crossed her face. You wouldn't dare destroy your own family. You destroyed my family 5 years ago, Hebel replied, stepping back from the car. I am just taking out the trash. Enjoy your ride, Mother. It will be one of your last in that car. He turned his back on her, pulling his phone from his pocket as he walked rapidly away. Richard! Hebel barked the moment the line connected. Accelerate the timeline. I don't want to wait until Monday. I want Simon Caldwell's life blown to pieces tonight. And get a security detail to the Fairmont Olympic. Nobody gets onto the penthouse floor without my explicit, verbal authorization. Simon Caldwell considered himself an untouchable man. As the chief legal counsel for Jason Omnicorp and a senior partner at one of Seattle's most prestigious law firms, he existed in a realm of bespoke suits, private aviation, and offshore accounts. That Saturday evening, Simon was dining at the Metropolitan Grill, enjoying a dry-aged Wagyu ribeye and a bottle of 2015 Opus One. He was entertaining 2 junior partners, regaling them with heavily redacted tales of his legal conquests, completely oblivious to the storm bearing down on him. He didn't notice the sudden hush that fell over the front of the restaurant. He didn't notice the maître d' stepping hastily aside. He only noticed when a shadow fell across his table. Simon looked up, his polite, predatory smile freezing on his face. Hebel Jason stood over him. Hebel wasn't wearing his usual perfectly tailored suit. He was still in his damp jeans and grey sweater, his hair disheveled. But the look in his ice-blue eyes was nothing short of lethal. Flanking Hebel were Richard Croft and 2 very large, very unsmiling men in dark suits. Hebel, Simon said, recovering quickly, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin. What a surprise. We were just discussing the upcoming merger. Get up, Hebel commanded. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The sheer, radiating authority in his voice caused the 2 junior partners to immediately push their chairs back and scramble away from the table. Simon frowned, glancing around at the other patrons who were beginning to stare. Hebel, This is highly inappropriate. If we need to discuss business, we can do it in the office on Monday." "We are doing it now," Hebel said. He slammed a thick manila folder onto the white tablecloth, right over Simon's half-eaten steak. "I spent the afternoon tracing a $10 million wire transfer, the one you authorized 5 years ago, to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. A shell company that, according to records subpoenaed from Credit Suisse this very afternoon, is wholly owned by you." Simon's face drained of color. The arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by a sudden, sickening panic. That's absurd. I have no idea what you are talking about. LaDonna Bennett stole that money." "LaDonna Bennett has been living in poverty for 5 years, Hebel interrupted, his voice echoing in the sudden silence of the dining room. "While you forged medical documents regarding her pregnancy, doctored photographs, and used my mother's influence to coerce her into signing a predatory NDA at a women's shelter." Simon swallowed hard. He looked at Richard, then at the 2 silent men behind Hebel. He knew exactly what was happening. He was being summarily executed in the corporate sense. "Hebel, listen to me," Simon stammered, standing up slowly, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "You don't understand the pressure I was under. Your mother, Beatrice, she orchestrated the entire thing. She came to me. She said if I didn't help her get rid of the girl, she would have me disbarred. She paid for the forged documents. I only took the money as collateral." "You took the money because you are a parasite," Hebel said coldly. "And my mother will face her own reckoning. But tonight, I'm dealing with you." Hebel snapped his fingers. Richard Croft stepped forward, handing Simon a single sheet of paper. "What is this?" Simon asked, his hands trembling as he took it. "That is a signed confession of wire fraud, embezzlement, and corporate espionage," Hebel stated. "You are going to sign it right now. Then, you are going to hand over the keys to your office, your corporate car, and your phone. You will surrender your passport to Richard. First thing Monday morning, you will formally resign and turn yourself in to the federal authorities." "And if I refuse?" Simon challenged, a desperate, cornered rat bravado flickering in his eyes. "You think you can just force a confession out of me in a steakhouse? I'm a lawyer, Hebel. I'll tie you up in litigation for a decade." Hebel leaned in close, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "If you refuse, I will not hand this over to the FBI. I will hand it over to the private equity groups you've been illegally funneling insider information to for the last 3 years. The ones who don't use lawyers to settle their debts. Do you understand me, Simon?" Simon stared into Hebel's eyes and saw exactly what he was looking for. Absolute, unyielding ruin. He wasn't negotiating with a CEO anymore. He was negotiating with a father who had been robbed of his children. Defeated, his hands shaking violently, Simon pulled a Mont Blanc pen from his breast pocket and signed the paper. Hebel snatched it back, handing it to Richard. Without another word to the ruined man, Hebel turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Simon Caldwell standing alone in the wreckage of his life. 40 minutes later, Hebel stood in the hallway outside the presidential suite of the Fairmont Olympic. The adrenaline of the confrontation with Simon was fading, replaced by a deep, gnawing anxiety. Destroying his enemies was easy. That was just business. Rebuilding a family he had fundamentally shattered? That was terrifying. He nodded to the 2 private security guards stationed at the heavy double doors. They stepped aside, and Hebel keyed the door open. The suite was expansive, all gilded accents, plush carpets, and panoramic views of the Seattle skyline. But Hebel's eyes immediately found the only things that mattered. LaDonna was sitting on the edge of a massive velvet sofa. She had showered, her hair was damp and falling freely around her shoulders, and she was wearing a thick hotel bathrobe. On the floor, In front of the giant flat-screen TV, Leo and Sam were fast asleep, tangled together on a pile of decorative pillows, exhausted by the emotional upheaval of the day. LaDonna looked up as the door clicked shut. The fear from the park was gone, but the exhaustion remained, deep and profound. She looked at him, not with anger, but with a weary, guarded caution. "They're safe," Hebel said softly, walking slowly into the room, keeping his distance so as not to overwhelm her. "Simon Caldwell is finished. He confessed. He's going to prison. And I've locked my mother out of everything. The board will remove her by Tuesday. She can never touch you or the boys again." LaDonna stared at her hands, twisting the belt of her robe. "And what happens now, Hebel?" she asked, her voice cracking. "You defeated the bad guys, but you were one of them, too. You believed them. You looked at me with so much hatred that night. I can't just forget that, because you put us in a nice hotel." Hebel felt a lump form in his throat. He sank into an armchair across from her, dropping his head into his hands. "I know," he whispered. "I know, LaDonna. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to just come back to me. I was arrogant, I was blind, and I broke the best thing I ever had." He looked up, his ice blue eyes bright with unshed tears. "But they are my sons, and you are still the only woman I have ever loved. I will spend the rest of my life proving to you that I can be the man you thought you married. Whatever you need, time, space, a house of your own, you have it. Just, please don't disappear again." LaDonna looked at the powerful billionaire, stripped of his armor, pleading with her in a hotel room. She looked down at the sleeping twins, who shared his face, his stubbornness, and his eyes. "I'm not disappearing, Hebel," she said quietly, the first tiny crack in her armor showing. "But we have a very, very long way to go." The following Monday morning, the atmosphere inside the boardroom of Jason Omnicorp was as volatile as a primed explosive. The panoramic windows offered a breathtaking view of the Seattle skyline, but none of the 12 board members were looking at the view. They were staring at the empty leather chair at the head of the table. Beatrice Jason sat to the immediate right of that chair, her posture rigid, her expression a mask of aristocratic disdain. She had spent Sunday night making furious phone calls, attempting to secure votes to declare her son mentally unfit for leadership. She planned to frame Hebel's sudden obsession with a barista and her illegitimate children as a psychological break. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. Hebel did not walk in alone. He was flanked by Richard Croft and 2 senior agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission. A collective murmur rippled through the room. Beatrice's face paled, the flawless facade cracking for the first time. "Good morning," Hebel said, his voice carrying the cold, hard edge of a guillotine blade. He walked to the head of the table but did not sit. "I apologize for the delay. I was busy finalizing the termination of our chief legal counsel, Simon Caldwell, who is currently in federal custody for wire fraud and embezzlement." The room erupted. Board members shouted over each other, demanding explanations. Beatrice gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles stark white. "Silence!" Hebel barked, slamming his hand flat against the polished wood. The room instantly quieted. Simon Caldwell did not act alone. He acted under the direct instruction and financial protection of a senior member of this board, a member who utilized company resources to forge documents, initiate illegal wire transfers, and conduct a campaign of malicious corporate espionage against my wife, LaDonna Jason. He didn't call her his ex-wife. The distinction was not lost on anyone. Hebel looked down at his mother. The ice-blue eyes they shared were locked in a silent, deadly battle. The SEC has been provided with a fully documented paper trail, including Caldwell's sworn confession, Hebel continued, his gaze never leaving Beatrice. Effective immediately, Beatrice Jassen is stripped of her board seat, her voting rights, and her access to all corporate assets pending a federal indictment. Security will escort you from the building, Mother. You are destroying your own legacy over a gutter-born gold digger, Beatrice hissed, standing up, her voice shrill with panic and venom. Those children are a liability. You will ruin this company. Those children, Hebel replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal calm, are my sons. They are the sole heirs to this empire. And you are a relic of a rot I am cutting out today. Get out of my building. As Beatrice was escorted away, shouting threats that fell on deaf ears, Hebel felt a massive, suffocating weight lift from his chest. The architects of his misery were gone. Now came the impossible part, rebuilding what they had destroyed. He didn't move LaDonna and the twins into his cold, sprawling penthouse. He knew the glass and steel fortress held nothing but traumatic memories for her. Instead, he purchased a secluded 6-bedroom estate in Medina, surrounded by old-growth cedar trees and featuring a sprawling backyard with high privacy fences. He staffed it with discreet, rigorously vetted security. He put the deed entirely in LaDonna's name. It's yours, Hebel told her, standing in the sunlit kitchen of the new house a week later. The twins were upstairs, marveling at bedrooms that were larger than their entire previous apartment. If you want to sell it and move to Europe, you can. If you never want to see me again, you can lock the gates. But you and the boys will never want for anything again. That is my promise. LaDonna stood by the marble island, tracing the veining in the stone. She looked exhausted, overwhelmed by the whiplash of moving from a cramped walk-up to a multi-million-dollar estate in the span of a few days. Hebel, I don't know how to do this, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. I spent 5 years teaching them that their father was a ghost. Now you're here. You gave us a mansion. You destroyed your own mother for us. It's too much. Too fast. I know, Hebel said gently, keeping a respectful distance. He wanted desperately to cross the room and pull her into his arms, to smell the vanilla and cinnamon in her hair, but he knew he hadn't earned that right. I will follow your lead, LaDonna. Completely. And so began the delicate, painful dance of reconciliation. Hebel visited the house every Tuesday and Thursday evening, and on Saturday afternoons. He didn't come in tailored suits. He wore jeans and faded t-shirts. He learned very quickly that his immense wealth meant absolutely nothing to 4-year-old boys. When he bought them a pair of $5,000 miniature electric cars, they played with the giant cardboard boxes they came in. When he hired a private chef to make them dinner, Leo threw a tantrum because he wanted the boxed macaroni and cheese his mother made. Hebel had to learn how to be a father from the ground up. He spent hours sitting cross-legged on the plush rugs, building structurally unsound Lego towers, only to have Sam gleefully smash them to pieces. He learned how to read the Gruffalo with the correct funny voices. He learned that Leo was terrified of thunderstorms, and that Sam was allergic to strawberries. He watched LaDonna watch him. Her guard was incredibly high. Every time he made a mistake, like raising his voice in frustration when a toy wouldn't assemble, he saw the flash of the old fear in her eyes, the fear of the ruthless CEO who had thrown her away. But he also saw the softening. He saw her small smile when she caught him asleep on the sofa, with both boys snoring on his chest. He saw the tension leaving her shoulders as the weeks turned into months, and she realized the security detail wasn't to keep her in, but to keep the world out. 6 months after the rainy afternoon at the Roasted Bean, the crisp Seattle autumn had surrendered to a bitter, biting winter. Hebel was in the middle of the most critical negotiation of his career. He was attempting a hostile takeover of a massive logistics firm based in Chicago, a deal worth over $2 billion. He was sitting in a glass-walled conference room, surrounded by lawyers and executives, finalizing the terms of the buyout. The tension in the room was palpable. Millions of dollars hinged on his next sentence. His private cell phone buzzed in his pocket. Only 2 people had that number, Richard Croft and LaDonna. He ignored it. It buzzed again. And again. Frowning, Hebel held up a hand, silencing the lead negotiator from the Chicago firm. He pulled the phone out. It was LaDonna. "Excuse me," Hebel said, standing up abruptly. He stepped out of the conference room and answered. "LaDonna? Is everything all right?" "Hebel," she sobbed. The sound of her panic sent a jolt of pure adrenaline straight into his heart. "It's Sam. He has a fever of 104. He's lethargic. He's barely breathing right. I'm in the ambulance. We're heading to Seattle Children's." Hebel didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way. I will be there before you are." He hung up, turned around, and walked back into the conference room. He grabbed his coat from the back of his chair. "Mr. Jassen?" the lead negotiator asked, looking bewildered. "Where are you going? We are minutes away from signing." "The deal is off," Hebel said flatly, not even looking at the man. He looked at his own team. "Table it. If they don't want to wait until Monday, let them walk." "Hebel, you can't be serious," one of his senior VPs gasped. "This is a $2 billion acquisition." "My son is in the hospital," Hebel snapped, his eyes flashing with a terrifying, protective ferocity. "I don't care if the building burns down while I'm gone. Do not call me." He sprinted to the elevator, his heart hammering in his throat. When Hebel burst through the sliding doors of the emergency room, he was a man unhinged. He bypassed the triage desk, ignoring the protests of the security guards, his eyes scanning the chaotic room until he found her. LaDonna was sitting in a plastic chair outside a trauma bay, her face buried in her hands, trembling violently. Leo was sitting next to her, clutching a stuffed bear, looking terrified. Hebel dropped to his knees in front of her. "LaDonna!" She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. They took him back. They think it's a severe respiratory infection. His fever won't break, Hebel. He's so small." Without thinking, Hebel pulled her into his arms. For the first time in 5 years, she didn't stiffen. She collapsed against his chest, burying her face in his neck, sobbing desperately. He wrapped his arms around her and Leo, pulling his family into a tight, fiercely protective embrace. "He is a Jassen," Hebel whispered fiercely into her hair, his own tears finally falling. "He is strong. He is going to be fine. I am right here. I am not going anywhere." They sat in that waiting room for 6 agonizing hours. Hebel held LaDonna's hand the entire time. He didn't check his phone once. He didn't think about the logistics firm, the billion-dollar deal, or the board of directors. He only thought about the woman beside him and the little boy fighting a fever on the other side of the wall. Just before midnight, a doctor finally emerged, looking exhausted but smiling. "The fever broke," the doctor announced. "It was a severe viral pneumonia, but we've got him stabilized on oxygen and IV fluids. He's sleeping peacefully. You can go see him." The relief that washed over them was absolute. LaDonna let out a breath she felt she had been holding for half a decade. She turned to Hebel, her eyes searching his face. She saw the tear tracks on his cheeks, the utter dishevelment of his usually perfect hair, the raw, unfiltered love and terror in his ice-blue eyes. She realized in that moment that the ruthless billionaire who had thrown her out 5 years ago truly was dead. The man sitting beside her was just a father, terrified for his child and a husband desperate to protect his wife. Later that night, as they stood side by side in the dim pediatric ICU, watching Sam sleep soundly with a tiny oxygen cannula under his nose, LaDonna leaned her head against Habel's shoulder. "You left the buyout meeting," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. It had been all over the news alerts on her phone while they waited. "The financial networks are saying you walked away from $2 billion. Habel slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. He looked down at his sleeping son, then over to the small cot in the corner where Leo was curled up under a blanket. "I didn't walk away from anything important," Habel said softly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I ran toward the only thing that matters." LaDonna closed her eyes, letting out a long, shuddering sigh. "We have a lot to figure out, Habel." "We have the rest of our lives," he replied. "I'm not asking you to forget the past, LaDonna. I'm just asking you to let me build the future." She looked up at him, the harsh fluorescent lights catching the faint, hopeful smile playing on her lips. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's build." The journey from the cramped, cinnamon-scented confines of the roasted bean to the quiet halls of the pediatric ward was paved with broken glass and bitter truths. Habel Jassen had learned the hard way that a legacy isn't built on stock portfolios, aggressive mergers, or the ruthless excision of vulnerability. It is built on the fragile, irreplaceable bonds of family. He had allowed deceit to blind him, letting his empire's architects dismantle his heart. But the universe, in its chaotic grace, had offered him a second chance in the form of 2 boys with piercing, ice-blue eyes. LaDonna's forgiveness wasn't a transaction. It was a slow, deliberate act of courage, earned not through wealth, but through Habel's unwavering presence in the trenches of actual parenthood. In the end, the billionaire didn't save his family with his fortune. He saved them by finally becoming a father.